welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Van Leer, for bringing us together for this very important conversation. My name is Elissa Strauss. I'm author of the book When You Care and the Substack Made with Care. And you can summarize my work as an obsession with understanding how care got left out of our understanding of who we are, all of our meaning-making systems, and the importance of putting it back at the center of the human story where it belongs as part of the way that humans function and thrive. And today we're going to talk about why we expect parents to do it alone. In so many countries around the world, this is the experience of modern day parenting. It's one of deep isolation. And I wanted to start by sharing two anecdotes where I realized that I, in fact, had these crazy assumptions that I was going to do it alone. I didn't realize I did until these two things happened. So the first is right around the time I had my first child, I went to my friend Ronit's house for dinner. And Ronit's from Israel, where there is often more like collaborative, communal kind of energy around parenting and understanding of parenting and how we relate to children. So I went to her house and there was a woman there that was so deeply enmeshed with her children, feeding them, joking with them, yelling at them, that I went up to Ronit a few hours later and I said, "It's so great that your sister's here." And Ronit said, "Who?" And I said, "That's not your sister?" And she's like, "No, I've never met that woman in my life." This blew me away because in my American parenting circles, we were almost terrified of engaging with each other's kids like that. That would be overstepping, crossing boundaries. And it honestly just like exploded my mind that there could be a culture where we would have a mutual understanding that it's okay to engage and parent with each other's kids. And in fact, we all win when we do that. A second example was my husband did not have paternity leave with our first child. He did have paternity leave with our second child. And the like Grand Canyon level difference of experiences was profound. And it's something, if you had asked me intuitively, like, "Oh, do you think it'd be a lot better when Nathaniel's home the second time?" I said, "Yeah, of course." But it was better in every single direction. And it was better in ways that actually lasted a lifetime in the way we parent together and our relationships with our children, my psychological well-being, my physical well-being, my ability to show up for baby Levi in the way I wanted to. So, I'm mentioning these stories because I'm someone who was, for my profession, a feminist writer who covered motherhood. And I had not really realized how, again, deeply ingrained the weird, when I say weird, I'm talking about Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, weird parenting had become the default and norm for me and for so many others around the world. And weird parents tend to be more individualistic, more structured in their approach to parenting, and more focused on individual achievement. And I think we're all here together today because we know this just isn't working anymore. Unsurprisingly, a recent study just found that parents with low social support were 2 to 3 times more likely to experience anxiety or depression than parents with high social support. And importantly, this support cannot just be instrumental or practical. It had to be social and emotional too. So when we're talking about why parents feel like they have to go it alone and the consequences of that, we're going to also address the social and emotional piece today. And it's not just about that practical support. We have with us today some really wonderful experts in child development and psychology, and they're going to help challenge this deeply ingrained notion, this notion that got me too, that parenting is an individual responsibility. We're going to think about how we can shift cultural norms and reimagine care networks that support all families holistically. And before we jump in, a bit of housekeeping. We invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat. Please write questions in the chat. There will be a way to upvote questions. I hope this will be intuitive in the chat. If it's not, ask and we'll explain in the chat. A chance to both post questions and upvote and respond to other people's questions. And at the end of the session, we will be asking our experts some of those questions. One more bit of housekeeping. There's going to be translation in French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I believe Charlotte is putting instructions for how to access the translations in the chat as well. So again, if you are a French, Spanish, or Portuguese speaker and you want to hear it in those languages, head to the chat and you will learn how to do that. Great, so I'm going to introduce our two experts today. Both wonderful thinkers, true inspirations for me. They were both featured in this year's Early Childhood Matters journal, which I edited. I guess I failed to mention that in my bio. I was the guest editor of this year's edition of Early Childhood Matters, and I got to meet and deal with the ideas of so many brilliant thinkers. And two of them are Alicia Lieberman, who is the Irving B. Harris Endowed Chair in Infant Mental Health, Professor and Vice Chair for Academic Affairs at the University of California, San Francisco. And Alicia is a real specialist in childhood trauma. Also with us is Alison Gopnik, an American psychologist and philosopher, and a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and the editor of a new project on the social science of caregiving. We're very excited to have you both with us today. We're going to start with some questions for each of them. We're going to be really, diving into this idea of, again, why do parents feel, why is it the default position for so many of us to feel like we have to do it all alone? So Alison, I'm going to start with you. I want to hear from you on how the conversation on care as an individual versus collective responsibility is changing. What will it take for us to get to this place, to not feel like we have to do this on our own? And what does evolution and psychology tell us about this, about the importance of making the shift from the individual to the collective? Thank you.
Yeah, there's something very strange about the way that we take care of children nowadays, as you've been mentioning, Elissa. Because in fact, one of the things that we know from evolution is that at the time that human beings evolved, one of the most distinctive things about us is that we have this very long, helpless childhood. We have more children. We kind of stack up children who are helpless. We also, interestingly, have this long 20-year period of postmenopausal grandmotherhood and elderhood in general, which is also very distinctive. So if you compare us to our closest primate relatives like chimpanzees, chimpanzee babies children are producing as much food as they're consuming by the time they're 7. And chimpanzees are typically dying in their 50s about the same time that they're no longer fertile. That's a really striking difference. And the best explanation that evolutionary psychologists have for this is that those two things are connected. What happened was that we developed this longer childhood, which enables us to do all the things that are distinctively human. Lets us learn more, lets us transmit culture from one generation to the next. But of course, it comes with this cost of care. And if you look at humans, again, we have a much wider range of caregivers, not only biological mothers, but biological fathers, what are called alloparents, people who aren't directly related, like your example, Elissa, and my personal favorite, the postmenopausal grandmothers and also grandfathers. So we have a much wider range of people who are taking care of children. That seems to be a really fundamental part of how we succeed as humans. It's by having this long childhood and then also having others who can come in and help take care of those children. Another group that's really important that we tend to neglect is older children. So in most cultures at most times, older children actually are taking care of younger children. And of course, that's a very good way of learning how to take care of children, is to actually get some apprenticeships and practice yourself. Now, consider the situation of your typical weird parent. They may possibly have had a younger sib, but not very many of them. They probably live far away from cousins and even grandmothers and grandfathers. They haven't actually looked after children very much until they have children themselves, which might be in their 30s or 40s. But what they have done is gone to work and gone to school. So what they tend to do is think, oh, okay, there's some formula that I can use to shape my child to come out the right way. And that's my individual responsibility, the way my grades or my work evaluations are my individual responsibility. And that's a very, very different picture than the picture we evolved with. I would highly recommend a wonderful podcast from Dorsa Amir, and Shana Lou Levy, who are anthropologists who've looked at caregiving across many different cultures. And it's just amazing how different the way that we typically think of as sort of the default of caregiving is from the way caregiving happens in many of these forager societies, for example. So I think the fact that we have changed the way that we live has really changed the way that we think about caregiving. And that's happened more even over the last 15 or 20 years than it did before. So you already see these changes with industrialization, but for reasons that are not completely clear, that's happened even more in the recent past. So you have this situation where children are not exploring, they don't have the freedom to be independent because they don't have that network of caregivers, and that affects the way that they learn about caregiving themselves.
Thank you, Alison. I think we have one or two more minutes here. Do you have any thoughts on what it'll take to reshape this paradigm to get the weird parents out of this weird mindset?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think part of the reason why caregiving has been so incredibly neglected in political science and economics and so forth, one reason is something to do with the people who've actually been doing the political science and economics and philosophy. Our joke about this is that maybe it's because they're all tall that they can't really see children. Um, but part of it is because caregiving doesn't fit the usual models for how we provide services in an industrial society. So markets obviously can play a role in caregiving, but markets aren't really the right way to do it. Overall, we feel as if we should have these close personal relationships. And that means that even though, again, states can provide a lot of support, and much more support than they typically do, that also doesn't seem to quite be right. So there's some way of balancing the fact that caregiving happens in these close personal relationships, and then the fact that we have very large impersonal institutions like states or markets that are typically providing services in our community. So some of the things that I think we could think about are things like individual family allowances, which many countries, although not the United States, have, where you're actually supporting people to take care of children. But I think also, you could imagine changing the physical environment. So my anecdote is that I have grandchildren in Montreal, which is lovely. Um, when I go to visit my grandchildren in Montreal, the houses are all these triplexes that look out over what they call a ruelle, a little alley in the back of the houses. And what that means is that just that physical setup means that often you have a grandmom can live in one of the apartments when the children are living in another, and all the children are out playing in the ruelle, and all the grandparents and parents are sort of sitting in the balconies and looking out over the ruelle. And that physical geography can make a big difference. And that's something that I think, oddly enough, the pandemic, for all of its awfulness, one of the benefits was that a lot of people started having this more intergenerational housing where parents and children and grandchildren were living in the same house. And to a remarkable degree, I think people discovered, oh, that's actually really good. It's a way of taking care of my parents and taking care of the grandchildren at the same time.
Thank you, Alison. And then before we jump to Alicia, will you re-mention the podcast you recommended? Make sure
Yes,
that
it's on in a wonderful series called the Many Minds podcast. It's the what's called the Diverse Intelligences series. It's a scientific series, and I can put it in notes. And then Dorsa Amir is one of the people, Dorsa Amir and Shana Lou Levy, who, by the way, have a wonderful recent paper reviewing the way that in other cultures, peers and children are the ones who are interacting, and those interactions between children of different ages are really important. That's another thing that's really odd about how we structure our lives, which is children are so age segregated. So, when you're in school, you're
yeah.
in school with children who are all the same age, and you aren't getting the chance to learn and to teach from older to younger children, which is something that you see in many other cultures. So, Doris, oh, great, there's a link to the
Yeah.
podcast in the notes. But it's really a wonderful podcast and gives you a very different perspective on how and why we could take care of children.
Absolutely. I've seen a lot of conversation lately on Substack questioning how quickly we are to pathologize children caring for younger children, to say to call them
Right,
parentified. And
Right.
that's a real thing, but I think we've become a little too quick to assume that anytime a child is helping with care responsibilities, there's something negative and psychologically destructive going on. So I'm so glad you mentioned that.
I will point this
Um,
out as the oldest child of six, which I'm convinced has played a role in my life and my interest in this ever since. But there aren't very many oldest children of six around anymore in the West, anyway.
Thank you so much, Alison. Now we're going to jump to Alicia. Alicia, your research focuses on a two-generation approach to well-being and the power of community support. Two-generation approach is the crazy radical idea that you can't just try to help children or parents. You actually have to think about helping them at the same time, and that the relationship between both of them is fundamental to their well-being. I went to a two-gen conference last year in Aspen. And it's kind of crazy to me that it's something we even have to keep saying out loud. And it's kind of a new and radical idea because I can't imagine something more intuitive. And that's why I appreciate your work so much, Alicia, for thinking through just how essential this two-gen approach is. So what I would love to hear from you, to hear you speak about now, is what you've learned as a psychotherapist on how to support parents more holistically through this two-generation lens. And you particularly do a lot of research on trauma. So I'd love to hear both kind of broadly speaking and in the context of trauma, again, the importance of this two-generation approach.
Thank you, Elissa. And Alison, I just want to say my heart was singing as you were speaking. So I just want to use what Alison said as a platform for everything else that I'm going to say. I had a child when I was a new immigrant here, coming from Paraguay and Israel, and being used to this extended family and community and everybody coming together. And I was shocked and depressed by this expectation that I was supposed to bond with my baby. And I think in some ways, unintended consequences, attachment theory, and all the emphasis on maternal sensitivity, maternal responsiveness has fostered this idea that it is all in the mother-child relationship. And I still remember when scientists started saying, where are the fathers? Where are the grandparents? It was like, yes, where are they? And that's what I wanted to do in my work. Include the fathers, include the aunts, include the grandparents, and have an intergenerational connection together with the two-generation approach. We now are more and more involved in a three-generation approach, because what we find is that very often with this emphasis on new improved philosophy in the West, where anything that's new is considered better, we are disconnected from the wisdom of our ancestors. And grandparents are afraid of telling their children what they think about what the grandchildren need, and the parents are often dismissive of what the grandparents are saying, and then there is this fear about speaking. The motto of my treatment is speaking the unspeakable, and it is really giving permission to people to say things that they are afraid of saying, for fear of offending, for fear of getting hurt, etc. And what we find is that when parents come to us saying, my child is aggressive, my child has been expelled from childcare, we start by acknowledging what it feels like, and then saying, and tell me, what's it like for you to be a parent? What has it been like to have this child? How has your life changed? What happened to you? And we see the body language change, so that they move from this feeling of what have I done wrong to how is my experience affected how I'm seeing the situation. And parents are so quickly criticized when their children are not doing well, and there is that feeling of self-blame, of shame, particularly for parents that are low income, who are immigrants, who are minorities, who already feel that the society is looking askance at them. And then this idea of giving them a safe space when we say, your experience matters to me. I don't care about you only as a parent, I care about you as a human being. And then we give them this sense of you have permission to be angry at your child because you are angry at your circumstances, who's supporting you so that you are able to support your child. And that changes the entire climate of the family. And then we start looking, we also ask what helps you and who helps you, and how can we strengthen those sources of support so that you feel that you are met emotionally in more ways than what I can offer. So we as therapists become part of an ecosystem that we help build. And I can't emphasize enough the role of community in terms of connecting them to family resource centers, for example, community centers, parents groups. And what we've done with child parent psychotherapy is move from continuing to do child parent psychotherapy and grandparent parent child psychotherapy, because very often we find that what happened to the grandparents is affecting the parent and is affecting the child, and having a community extended family conversation is very healing. But also creating groups. We have a group called Attachment Vitamins, where we start by asking, was there a moment last week that you felt really close to your child? And that is such a great way of beginning, because the parents feel I'm not just immersed in my stress, there were also good moments. And we have another group that is for immigrants that's called Building Bridges, where we use song and food and memories of the countries of origin to build connection among the parents. And so building community is part and parcel of the treatments that we provide.
Thank you, Alicia. Beautiful answer. So we're going to dive in now to more conversation with Alicia and Alison. Trying to, dig in deeper into what aspects of society are responsible for making parents feel isolated and isolating parents, and the ways to mitigate that. So Alison, you spoke a little bit about kind of urban infrastructure, urban planning, city planning, house design. So I don't know if you want to start there a little bit, because I think there's a lot to say with how we physically live and how it impacts our sense of the collective when it comes to parenting. And anything else you want to add of kind of these like specific roadblocks that might be hiding in plain sight, perhaps, that really get in the way of us feeling as though parenting is a collective endeavor.
Yeah. Well, as I said, the physical environment is obviously a big one. The sense of, again, this kind of the fact that parenting or taking care of people, caregiving, doesn't fit the typical economic models is a big issue. So, on the one hand, we sort of feel like, well, this isn't close, intimate thing. It's not the sort of thing that you could buy and sell. But on the other hand, what that means is that we don't have any economic support. So in a world where everything is about things that you can buy and sell, to have this thing that's so important and so central that isn't something that you could buy or sell is really difficult and challenging. So trying to figure out ways that you could have, I mean, an idea that I've had, for example, is suppose you had a grandmother in each preschool class. So someone who wasn't, a trained ECE teacher, you need to have trained early childhood teachers. But suppose you just have someone who's in the community, who's an older person, who just wants to hang out with a bunch of 3-year-olds. That means you have an extra person, and an extra person who, as exactly as Alicia beautifully said, has that wisdom and has that tradition and can do things with the kids. and function like a grandmother. And then you could use that to support that older person too. So, pay the older person sort of twice what they would get with Social Security, as a way of giving them support for being able to do that. That's an example. A little anecdote, literally just from yesterday, my grandchildren were visiting, and my parents are in an assisted living facility in Berkeley, which is a very, nice, positive, well-run place. But my son took my 2-year-old grandson in to visit his great-grandparents. And there was just such incredible joy in that room. They went to the cafeteria, they had breakfast. Kit was running around talking to everybody, and you could just feel the way that everyone in that room was suddenly alive and happy and involved and engaged. And having that child there was really transformative. But of course, what we do is we age segregate out older people too. So it's sort of, okay, the older people are here, the babies and children are in the preschool, the parents are either at home or in their office, and trying to think of ways of getting more integration across the generations, I think just by itself would be something that not only would be supportive to parents, but would be supportive to all the other people who are involved with children. I've often had this experience, and you may have had this experience too, where, my younger colleagues in the department, for instance, have children, and I say, I love 3-year-olds, just let me know, I'd love to spend time with them. But there isn't a kind of easy way for that to actually happen, right? That it's like sort of like, oh yes, well, thank you, but there aren't mechanisms or norms for doing that. So I think those are all things. The last thing to say, and I again agree with Alicia here, is that I worry that our science has actually sometimes sort of backfired, because the picture that people have gotten is, okay, there's a bunch of scientists, they know what the right way is to do this, the same way you'd know about public health or other kinds of areas. And the scientists are telling us it's really, really important. And, our children, the way that we behave is really going to determine the way our children grow up. And especially in a world with an information economy where things like how well you do at school or how smart you are or how well you get along with others, you sort of feel like, okay, that's going to determine your whole economic future, right? I think there's this kind of model of, okay, the people like Alison Gopnik and Alicia Lieberman are telling us that children, even very little children, even babies, are learning a tremendous amount in those first few years, which is true and an important message for us to give. But then they're thinking, okay, how do you learn? Well, you go to school. So what we need to do is put babies and preschoolers and children in a school-like setting. And if only we do it the right way and we get the right lessons and we get the right methods, they'll come out, they'll come out the way that we want them to come out. So when in my book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, I tried to use this metaphor of think about the difference between being a carpenter who's actually building something and wants the thing that you build to come out a particular way, and a gardener where what you want to do is to create an environment where many, many different kinds of plants and flowers can thrive. And that kind of a system can change when things change. A last thing, sorry, I think I said this was last, but just one more thing to say, again, very relevant to what Alicia was saying, is having a sense of the incredible variety of what children are like, and how much what parents do depends on what the children are like rather than the other way around. So, it's completely different. And again, as a grandmother of 6 now, I'm really conscious of the fact that the way that I grandparent is different for each one of those 6 children. And those children are determining what your life as a caregiver is like as much as the opposite. And respecting and understanding those differences between, the child who can't sit still for a minute versus the child who's shy versus the child who's just completely fascinated by language. Understanding those differences is a really important part of caregiving. But I think the general picture is, look, caregiving's on the one hand, one of the most difficult things we do, but it's also one of the most rewarding things that we do, just moment by moment. And insofar as caregivers can be concentrating on exactly what Alicia was saying about what's this moment that you had with a child that's just a wonderful, satisfying moment for you both in the present, rather than thinking, what's a technique that I can use that will make my child come out a particular way 20 years from now? I think that would make things much more, make the role of being caregiving much easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Two thoughts sprung to mind when you were speaking. The first, in relation to grandparents and older folks helping out in preschools, there's research that shows that older adults who, not full-time caregivers, if you're the primary solo
Right.
caregiver for a child, that can be detrimental to your health. But if you're involved in caregiving in another capacity that's not full-time, it boosts your health. It prevents dementia. It boosts your immune system. So if we think about, right, the 2-gen, 3-gen approach, there's a ripple effect, and everyone wins, and the healthcare system wins, and our healthcare budget, our national healthcare budget wins, when we find ways to bring the generations together through the portal of care. And yeah, and just one other thing that came to mind, my kids are 8 and 12 now, so we feel like we're really some very heavy doors shut, and like early parenting is behind us. We can leave them home alone. And so we've tried now to pay it forward. What we always kind of dreamed of, that's to offer people we know, maybe not super, super well, but well enough to, like, we'll drop your baby off at our house, your toddler, have dinner down the block, come back an hour and a half later. And it's like they want to, but they're terrified,
Yeah.
And I think when you spoke about the science, so we're trying to create the world we want to live in. But as you said, the science backfiring in a way, like they're so sure about, or feel so terrified that if they don't check all those instrumental boxes of parenting, if their kid's not spoken to in a certain way or fed a certain way, that everything can fall apart. So it's like, how do we kind of dissolve that fear that so many parents live with? It's so much work to do. Alicia, I'm going to turn to you, and I would love to hear a little bit about the work you've done in Colombia. Putting moms at the center of their own healing, because I think that's a really powerful part of the work you've done and the way you view trauma, is that it doesn't always have to be an expert-led approach to healing and strengthening strengthening the psychology of moms and strengthening the communal bonds of moms, that we can actually find ways to create frameworks where they could do it themselves. So if you want to share a little bit about that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in Colombia, we were asked to bring child parent psychotherapy to Colombia because of all the families that were displaced by the decades-long civil war in Colombia. And we were asked by economists to do that because they discovered that child parent psychotherapy is very cost effective. So it was something that they wanted to do. And as we talked with them, because it is an ecology that of care that we pursue, we go to work in communities with what the community wants. We found that there weren't psychologists, there weren't trained therapists. And so we thought, well, who are the repositories of that ancestral wisdom? And it was grandmothers, it was older mothers who really had a lot of respect in the community. And they were also overwhelmed by their experience of war, adversity, displacement, violence, fear. And they were talking about how the younger parents were very um, uh, punitive with their little children, and feeling that their little children were misbehaving, were aggressive, were impossible, were spoiled. And one of the big things that we have discovered in our work is that under anger, under aggression, there is 95% of the time fear. That aggression and anger are self-protective mechanisms when we are feeling scared and helpless and need to protect ourselves by fighting back. And so we turned the question around and again asked, what happened to this child? What happened to you? And then we discovered that they had seen a lot of violence. They had been abused. The parents had been abused. They had seen domestic violence in their and then by connecting with what did it feel like, and getting them to talk about how tired they were, how alone they felt, how helpless they felt, then going to and what helps you, and the sense of who helps you, and identifying people who were helpful to them, resources that were helpful to them, which was often a wise person in the community. That's when we created groups that would meet with us to talk about our overall philosophy and then to tell us about the cultural practices that had been helpful to them from generation to generation. And it became a wonderful practice that went from one community now to all over Colombia, and where people are wanting to export it to other places as well. So I think that what we were modeling is that all care is interpersonal, reciprocal, is a question of what is your experience, what is my experience, what can I offer you, what can you offer me, and what do we grow together in this garden that Alison talks about, where the more diversity, the more cross-pollination.
Yeah.
And I think that the cross-pollination of everything that we have to offer is really where it's at. So I highly recommend Alison's book. I just found it marvelous and
Thank you.
so consistent with our experience.
Thank you, Alicia. I'm going to play Genie now, and I'm going to grant you each 3 wishes of changes you would like to see in the world. It could be something that kind of like a mass change in individual psychology and our understanding of care, or structural policy changes of what we need, what needs to happen to foster stronger infrastructure and create a world in which caregiving isn't something we think we have to do on our own. Alison, I'll start with you. And yeah, I'm curious, you can have more than 3 wishes if you have more than 3 wishes. And since I'm not a real genie, it's fine. Yeah.
Just one thing that I wanted to mention, from the scientific perspective, I think a lot of times one of the barriers to having this kind of intergenerational relationship is a sense that parents have that, well, wait a minute, the grandparents saying something different from what I was saying. When we did some work in Peru, that was a lovely example. We had at a preschool, and we said, well, the kids can have a sandbox, and the parents were saying, the kids are playing in the sand at home. We don't want a bunch of sand to be tracked around from the preschool. And we would say, well, how about bringing in the grandmothers? And they say, oh no, the grandmothers are very old fashioned. We want our children to be raised in a modern way. And I think even in our culture, a lot of times there's this feeling that the kids are going to get confused because, grandmom is saying, no, you can't do this, or grandmom is saying, yes, you can. You can have ice cream and mom isn't, and the kids are going to get confused. And everything we know from the science is having that range of different possibilities is actually good for kids. That what kids are very good at saying, oh, okay, this is a way that you could function. This is a way you could function. I'm going to make sense out of that variety in the context of these people all love me. These people are all warm and caring, and they behave so differently, but that is a way of thinking about, as exactly as Alicia was saying, that kind of diversity allows each generation to do the kind of cross-pollination, and I'm going to take this from the way grandma behaves, and this from the way mom behaves, and this from the way the cousins behave. So that's one thing that I think would be sort of having an appreciation of not just the diversity of children, but also that for children to have an appreciation of here's the diversity of all the different ways that people could be. I do think that having caregiving not be so invisible, that would be my second wish. Now, I have to say my siblings and I are all very involved, have been very involved in caregiving for my parents, as I mentioned, my 90-year-old parents. And when I say, if we had a good cognitive science, computational, scientific story about caregiving, that's really what we need, they sort of roll their eyes and say, yeah, that's what you would say, Alison. But I still think it's true that if caregiving was centered in areas like economics and politics and cognitive science, that would be a help, because those are the things that really determine a big part of a big part of the way that we think. And it's this weird thing with caregiving, which is everybody says it's incredibly important, it's morally deep, it's meaningful, but it's totally invisible. Then when you look at the gross domestic product, for example, literally it's invisible. It doesn't show up. Nobody's treating that as if it's productive work. So making caregiving visible in the society, I think would be another thing that would be really helpful. So valuing it, but also just paying attention to it would be something that would be really helpful. And maybe this is just saying the same thing over again, but if we could get rid of the divisions across generations, I think that would be my third wish. If we could really change this very strange thing that we do now, where the grandparents are in, the parents are at work and the children are in school and the grandparents are in Florida, we could get rid of that physical separation. Because one of the other important things that I think really comes out with care is, the way I put it sometimes is we don't care for people because we love them because we care for them. So it's actually that experience of caring for people, for being close, for being in the same place. And again, I think this is a point that Alicia is making. Actually, oddly enough, caring for someone and being cared for can itself be a healing, important process for people. So actually letting people be in a physical setting, whether they're, obviously related to one another or not, whether they're kin, whether they're sort of official professional caregivers, but just giving people that experience of care when they feel cared for themselves, that's a really deep, positive part of the human experience that we don't pay very much attention to. Think of the amount of rating and legal status and thinking we have about erotic love, right? Nobody feels like we don't pay enough attention to erotic love. That's paid attention to. But the love that we feel when we're caring for a child or caring for an elder or caring for a spouse who's ill, that doesn't sort of show up in the culture in the same way. And part of it is recognizing, as we do with erotic love, that there's two sides, that it's incredibly deep and important and can be incredibly stressful and difficult at the same time. But it's central. It's central to who we are as people, not something peripheral.
One thing that I would say, Alison, is that again, I ditto, right? I agree with everything, and I think that the common denominator in all the things that you said is changing how we define success.
Yes.
From money and fame and high status to that and togetherness, closeness, family, friendship, etc. I think we are the United States is such, and the West, it has been, and we've exported such an individualistic definition and materialistic definition of success and of the good life that we have left behind what relationships are, and it's a kind of unilateral pursuit of more money, more success, more promotion, more, and the costs of that in the suicide rates among teenagers, in the toxic experience of loneliness, where growing percentages of adults say they don't have a close friend. That is left out of the GDP. The enormous economic cost of that might be a wake-up call, because it might speak in the same language of money that the whole society is organized around.
Yeah, another interesting thing from the evolutionary perspective, the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy, whose books I highly recommend about this, she has a new book called Father Time that, by the way, really makes this wonderful point about care, where she looked at gay fathers who adopt children. And you see, even though this isn't something that's been, a typical part of our evolutionary history, when you care for a baby, you see the same sort of brain changes that you see in biological mothers, for example.
Right.
But one thing a point that Sarah's made that I think is really important is that our joint enterprise of caregiving is a way that people make connections with one another. So it's when you have more than one person, you have a community, and you're involved in how can we both coordinate caring for someone. That itself is a really important way of making bonds. So the way that when you're caring for someone with someone else, gives you a way of having a social connection that you wouldn't have otherwise. It's really striking with my siblings who are scattered all over the world now, but the joint enterprise of taking care of our parents has been an incredible force to bring us together. And I think that's just true in general. And in fact, Sarah suggests that our human capacities for cooperation, which are one of the most distinctive things about us, is that we cooperate with one another. Again, the traditional sort of picture has been, oh, that's because men had to get out and coordinate themselves to get the mastodon, right? And it's probably much more accurate to say that's because people had to get together to coordinate to take care of these helpless babies because you couldn't do it on your own. So joint care itself is a way of trying to alleviate that kind of loneliness. And, one of the things that is complicated, but I think maybe relevant to point out, people have pointed out that part of the fact that people are not having as many children as they want is because there's this model in the West that first you have to be financially successful and materialistically successful and, have your work, and then you can kind of afford to have children as if it's a kind of luxury that you have at the end of the process. And very often that means that people end up not having children, even if they want to, and sort of changing that attitude would be a way of promoting social connection and dealing with this epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah, I'm going to jump. Alicia, quickly, I want to say to everyone, if you have any more questions or observations you would like Alicia and Alison to unpack, put them in the chat because we're going to be moving towards that in a minute. And before we move towards that, Alicia, I just wanted to see if you had any wishes, changes you think that if this happened, we'd really see a huge impact in terms of parents feeling like they have to be so alone in parenting.
Well, I think we really need to be frontal in our taking issue with the prioritization of economic success at the higher levels and the ripple effects that it has, so that people are getting the message of, if you are not economically successful, you are not a valued member of society. And so many people, as the middle class shrinks and as the pressures of not having a social support umbrella increase, so that childcare becomes impossible it's unaffordable. And as more and more isolation happens and people are blamed for their lack of success, in spite of the economic forces that move towards an increasing what's it called, inequality, so that more and more wealth is concentrated among an increasingly number of people. I think we need to take issue with that. I think that it has to be an economic issue, and it has to be an issue of giving families living wages, giving families the opportunity to really have benefits, so that they have health support, that they have. I think we really need to push back against these forces of fragmentation that are becoming more and more acceptable in society, because we are disconnecting from the message that we're trying to give of this is a communal system where we all need to be together, and billionaires are not going to save us. It is really a matter of thinking of how to have a better distribution of money, so that it reaches all of us and families can afford to take care of their children and to make space and time for relationships, because relationships take time. And families often feel that they don't have the time because survival is the priority. So it is a deeply unfair social and economic system that I think we really need to take issue with. And I think it takes all of us to do it.
Absolutely. And it's amazing kind of how far up the income ladder the stress is felt more and
That's
more every day. You know, it's the kind of stress over money, the stress over your child's future weaves its way into so much of the daily experience of parenting now for so many.
Can I just give you one example? I've been looking at the prices of strollers.
Yeah.
There is such a pressure to believe that strollers need to cost $3,000,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that even at a higher level, there is this feeling of
Yeah.
nothing is good enough.
Yep.
And so we've become completely unrealistic in terms of what is pushed, and it is all driven by the wish to sell and sell at ever higher prices. And people are feeling very dispirited about that. So I
Yeah.
think that it really needs all of us to speak about the emperor has no clothes. And we really need to start thinking of
Yeah.
what is good enough and give it to
Yeah,
everybody.
absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to jump to a few questions. We have about 5 minutes for questions and answers, and then 5 minutes to hear some closing remarks. So one question from Petra from the Dutch Youth Institute is asking you guys if you know anything about the barriers parents face in asking for and accepting help, and what could lower those barriers. So, right, there's a general sense everyone kind of knows they want more help, needs more help, but they're just not asking for it. So any thoughts on what kind of perhaps internal, external obstacles are getting in the way? And I think, Elissa, in a way, what you were speaking actually, I think does connect to it, because there's a sense of perfectionism. I mean, there's always something more and better you could do for your kids now. Like if there's the 3,000 stroller today, there's going to be the 5,000 one tomorrow, right? This is how the stroller market has worked. And so yeah, I think it's, I think that, in my opinion, I'm curious what you think, that actually gets in the way of asking for help when there's always this sense that it could be done better and more perfect. And if you only have this or that, your child will succeed.
You know, what I found also is very often not waiting for parents to ask for help, but to act by giving help in very small ways,
Mm.
in whatever
Yeah.
encounter we have.
Yeah.
Um, Picking up a little hat that fell on the ground and then
Mhm.
having that as a conversation. One thing I want to end my part with an anecdote. My father was a pediatrician, and we would go for long walks, and he would say to a mom with a newborn without a hat in the winter, you know, babies lose heat over their heads, through their heads. I suggest that you put a hat on him. And I would go, "Ay, Daddy, you don't, this is the United States. You don't just talk to strangers on the street and give them advice." Or he would go by a group of teenagers smoking and say, "It's not good to smoke. Right now it feels good, but when you are older, your lungs are going to look black and you don't want that." And I think now I think of him with so much admiration and love and respect, and saying, "Good for you, Dad, that you crossed that bridge and you didn't give a damn how people thought of you." Once he did that with a mother that asked for his address and then told him, "Turns out that my child had high cholesterol and you discovered it by looking at his eyes. Thank you."
Mm,
There is so much I think that we can do by leaning in and taking the first step. And then that gives the message to parents of, "Oh, you are there for me. You saw what I needed and gave it to me." And I think we can do that in every little step in our life.
yes. Yeah. I've been on planes. I try to play peekaboo kind of with the
Yeah.
baby in front
Yeah.
of me. I know the
Yes.
mom's not going to let me hold the baby for her, but I'll put down my book and I'll do this for as long as I can, you know, and it's like
Yes.
just these small acts. And the mom's nervous, I see, and she turns around, or sometimes the dad, but often the mom. And then she could tell I'm good. We're good. I accept that a small human child is on this plane, which is apparently very unusual these days.
And
Allison, I have a
all the passengers are so grateful to you because you stopped the baby from crying, right?
yeah,
So it's a
exactly.
collective intervention that you are doing.
Yes. I'm speaking of the collective. We have 1 minute for this. There's so many great questions. We have 1 minute for this, and then we'll move to Karima. Alison, it's a good question for you. So you spoke a lot about grandparents. One of the question askers asked, any thoughts on moving beyond grandparents into neighbors, family, friends,
Right.
you know, other kind of other people that we can get
Vulnerable.
involved with the care for our children and or creating collective care infrastructure in
Yeah,
our
I mean, I
communities.
think
Yeah.
the idea would be that having this diversity of people with different abilities, I've argued that there's actually a different kind of intelligence for children and for
Right.
elders, for example. I mean, literally, that their brains and minds are designed to be intelligent in different ways. And the more you could encourage that, the better. But there was something relevant to that I wanted to say, which is, you know, part of the problem is there's this strange moral panic in the weird about strangers, right? And
Mhm.
people, you know, even like not letting children go for sleepovers or not
Yeah.
letting them be involved with a stranger on a street who says, oh, you know, look, what a cute baby. Or as you said, that, you know, the mom wouldn't let you hold her baby. There's this very strange thing that's very detached from reality about
Yeah.
somehow strangers are out there trying to harm children. And it's very much not connected to reality, but it's been one of the things that's contributed to this idea that I don't want to interact with anybody except the people that I really know.
Can I give an anecdote that illustrates what Alison is saying? My grandson is his, when he was 7, I took him for a walk in Georgetown. And I couldn't find my way to the Lincoln Monument. So every 4 blocks or so, given that I have no sense of direction, I would stop and ask somebody, uh, could you tell me, please? And they would give me these lovely directions. And at the end of the day, my grandson said to me, I learned 2 things today. I learned that I don't need to be shy, and I learned that people I don't know are very kind and safe.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
This
That's the
is
monument, right? You know,
exactly what we're
that's the
talking about.
monument. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, all right. Thank you so much, Alison and Alicia. We've all learned so much from you today. Thank you for your research and changing this narrative and changing our realities in the right direction when it comes to collective care. I'm gonna introduce Karima Grant, who's the Van Leer Regional Representative for Africa, and she's going to offer us some closing remarks. Again, thanks everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Elissa, for that graceful moderation. Beginning with a personal story, I think we've all been there in all these places where in our own journeys as parents, you know, we've been struck by our own vulnerability and so very helpful to have finally, I think, more and more conversations happening in different corners of the world where we're really looking at, I think, as you said, Alison, is like how important is it for us to really make caregiving more visible? So I really love the frame of this conversation that we're really thinking about, you know, how do we make it more visible? And within that, what are the paradigms that need to change? Alicia, you really talked about just how important, and in our part of the world, how important financial security and, you know, being able to assure also, you know, your physical security, how important that is for parents. And I think that that goes to this idea of this intersectional nature of support, and that all of us, no matter where we are at the intersection of so many different realities as parents. And it's less about us saying, oh, okay, in the West, you have more opportunities of this, or we have more opportunities here, than to look at how do we create the systems wherever parents are. So before we end this wonderful conversation, and again, really feeling very grateful and honored to be on this platform with you three, and then with all of these lovely people, 70, I think we got up to about 75 people joining in this conversation, and that just gives us so much hope. But before we go, I did want to mention that at the foundation, we're working with Challenge Works and our partners FEMSA and the Maria Cecilia Foundation, as well as the Lego Foundation, to run the Good Start Challenge. And the Good Start Challenge is all about how we can think together, how we've come together as foundations, but how we're also looking for innovators, people who are already thinking and have these great ideas, to be thinking about how we can change the paradigms for parents and make a better start to parenting, because we know that when a child is born, when all of our children were born, we were all born as parents, so super important. We have information in the chat about the Good Start Challenge. Very briefly, it's happening in Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Senegal, Ethiopia, Uganda, and in Kenya. But I think it's a terrific opportunity for everyone, even if you're not in those countries, just to check out the website, because we're profiling just a lot of these wonderful, wonderful initiatives and raising this question and raising what does it look like for the beginning of parenthood to be a strong start for all of us. So I think with that, I'm going to say thank you again, because I've learned a lot. I've been fortified a lot, and deeply grateful for it. Of course, I'm going to tell everybody to go and check out ECM. Elissa did a great job. We also have our Substack. We'll have all of those again in the day, so please check out. And of course, Alison and Alicia, your work is always, always, always so influential in helping to shape a great start. So on behalf of everybody at Van Leer, on behalf of these wonderful women, I can't believe I'm sitting sort of horizontally with, we want to say thank you for joining us, and please stay tuned to the Good Start Challenge and of course all of our future conversations around ECM. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. This is
Thank you.
Be well.